Have you ever read something at work that made your body freeze before your mind even understood why? Not the dramatic kind of freeze. Not the kind where alarms go off inside your chest. Quiet kind. The kind where your hand just stops moving over the mouse and the office sounds around you. The keyboards, the distant Slack notification, the hum of the HVAC. All of it just recedes, like someone turned the volume dial slowly toward 0, and all that's left is you and the words on your screen and a feeling you don't have a name for yet. That's how it started for me. Tuesday afternoon in October. My coffee had gone cold on the left side of my desk, which meant I'd been staring at my monitor for longer than I realized. The email was from James Walker, VP of Strategic Accounts at Meridian Consulting Group, sent at 4:47 p.m. to a distribution list that included 6 names, none of which were mine. My name was in the body of the email. In a sentence I read 3 times before I allowed myself to understand it. I'm going to tell you exactly what that sentence said. But first I need to tell you who I was before I read it, because the person I was before matters as much as what happened after. My name is Eva Hartley. I am 38 years old. I have straight blonde hair that I keep pulled back at work because somewhere in my second year at Meridian I decided that looking like I was ready to present was the same as being ready to present, and I've never fully let go of that habit. I have 2 kids, a boy named Noah who is 9 and a girl named Claire who is 6, and a husband named Daniel who teaches high school history and who has, over the years, developed a very specific expression he uses when I tell him I'm going to be home late again. It isn't anger. It's something quieter than anger, and in some ways harder to look at. I had been at Meridian Consulting Group for 6 years and 4 months when the email arrived. 6 years and 4 months of building something I was proud of. I joined as a mid-level account strategist when the firm had around 200 employees and a client roster that was solid but not extraordinary. I worked on 3 accounts in my first year and turned one of them, a regional insurance group that had been stagnant for 18 months, into what eventually became one of our flagship case studies. I was promoted to senior strategist at the end of year 2. By year 4 I was leading a team of 3 and managing what James Walker called, in my last annual review, the most consistently high-performing account portfolio in the division. I kept a copy of that review. I kept copies of a lot of things. Not because I was paranoid, I want to be clear about that, but because I was organized. I had a folder on my desktop called Documentation, and inside it were performance reviews, client feedback emails, project timelines, deliverable records. I built that folder the way some people build emergency funds. Not because I expected to need it, because the responsible thing is to have it anyway. I thought that folder was about professionalism. I didn't understand yet what it was actually for. Before I tell you what was in James's email, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Leave a comment. I read every single one, and I'm always struck by how many different places, different lives, different situations are represented in this community. If this kind of story resonates with you, consider subscribing. Stay until the end of this one, because what I want to share with you in the final minutes is something I wish someone had told me a long time ago. It might be exactly what you need right now. Andrew Chen joined Meridian Consulting Group in August, 8 weeks before the email. I want to describe him to you the way I experienced him in those first weeks, because how I perceived him then is important to understanding how badly I misread the situation. Andrew was 31, second-generation Taiwanese American, with close-cropped black hair and the kind of unhurried, precise way of speaking that made everything he said sound considered. He dressed well, not flashy but well. He asked good questions in meetings, the kind of questions that demonstrated he'd done his reading before walking into the room. He was unfailingly polite. He brought coffee for the whole team on his 3rd day without being asked and without making a production of it. My first impression of Andrew Chen was, this one is going to be fine. James Walker introduced Andrew to me personally, which was slightly unusual. New hires in my division typically came through HR orientation and a team lead introduction, not a direct VP handoff. But James explained it easily enough. Andrew had been recruited specifically for a new service line Meridian was developing around predictive account modeling, and since that work would intersect significantly with my existing portfolio, it made sense for me to be his primary onboarding resource. "Think of it as mentorship," James said, with that easy smile he had, the one that always made you feel like you were being included in something rather than assigned to something. James Walker was 52, tall, with close-cropped silver-gray hair, and the kind of measured confidence that came from having been the smartest person in most rooms for most of his career. He wore very good suits and never seemed rushed, which in a consulting environment was itself a kind of power. "I'd appreciate the guidance," Andrew said, looking at me with an expression that seemed genuinely grateful. I told him I was glad to help. Meant it. I had no reason not to mean it. The first month went smoothly. I met with Andrew 3 times a week, sometimes in the small glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor, sometimes at his desk, once over lunch at the deli 2 blocks from the office where he ordered the same thing both times, and I noticed because I noticed those details about people without deciding to. I walked him through my account management framework. I explained the client communication protocols I'd developed over 6 years, the specific rhythms of check-ins, the way I structured quarterly business reviews, the reporting templates I'd built from scratch and refined through iteration. Andrew absorbed it all with the attentiveness of someone who was genuinely learning. He took notes in a small black notebook rather than on his laptop, which I found slightly unusual but also somehow reassuring. It felt like a signal that he was paying real attention rather than just archiving. He asked follow-up questions the next session that referenced specific things I'd said in the previous one. He was building on the information rather than just collecting it. I told Daniel one night, after the kids were in bed and I was unloading the dishwasher while he sat at the kitchen table grading papers, that the new guy was good, that it was actually kind of energizing to teach someone who wanted to learn. Daniel looked up from his papers and said, "That's great, Eva." The way he said it, not quite flat but measured, made me look at him for a moment. He went back to grading. I finished the dishwasher and went to bed. I think about that exchange sometimes. About what he might have been seeing that I wasn't. The second month was when things began to feel slightly off in ways I couldn't articulate. Started with small things. Tiny things. The kind that individually mean nothing but collectively create a pattern that your nervous system registers before your conscious mind does. The first thing, James began including Andrew in client emails that had previously been addressed only to me and the relevant account team. Not as a CC, as a full recipient, positioned in the to line alongside me. When I mentioned it to James, he said Andrew was being looped in for context, given the new service line overlap. Reasonable. I noted it and moved on. The second thing, Andrew started attending the Thursday morning account review meetings. These meetings had been my forum. I ran the agenda, I presented the portfolio updates, I fielded questions from James and the other VPs. Andrew sat at the far end of the table and took notes. He didn't say much, but he was there. Have you ever had the experience of noticing something that seems harmless, maybe even helpful, but something in the back of your mind quietly files it away as significant? That's what was happening. I didn't understand why my body was filing these things. I told myself I was being territorial. I told myself that was unbecoming. The third thing, and this is the one that, looking back, should have been louder, was a comment James made in passing one afternoon when I stopped by his office to go over Q4 projections. He was reviewing something on his screen, and without looking up he said, "Andrew's been asking really sharp questions about the Hartwell account." Pause. Hartwell Financial Services was my anchor client. 6-year relationship, built entirely through my work. I had personally recovered that account from a service failure that predated my tenure and turned it into a $2.4 million annual engagement. What kind of questions? Yes. James looked up with that easy smile. Just engagement history, relationship architecture. Getting himself oriented. He went back to his screen. "You've been a great resource for him, Eva. He mentions it all the time." I nodded and said I was glad it was useful. I left his office with the Q4 projections tucked under my arm and a feeling in my chest that I couldn't name. That evening I stayed late. The office emptied around 7 and I sat at my desk in the specific quiet of a corporate space after hours. The hum of the servers somewhere in the building, the orange glow of the city coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the slight chemical smell of carpet cleaner that only surfaces when the foot traffic stops. I opened my documentation folder and I stared at it for a long time. I didn't add anything that night. I didn't know yet what I was looking for. But I left the folder open on my desktop when I went home. The email arrived 6 weeks later. It was a Tuesday, 4:47 p.m., and I only saw it because James had accidentally included my address in the distribution instead of the correct alias for the Strategic Accounts Leadership Group. I know it was an accident because of what it contained, and because of how quickly a recall request arrived. 11 minutes later at 4:58 p.m. But I had already read it. And once you've read something, no one can reach into your brain and unread it. The email was a summary of what James described as the Q1 transition plan for the legacy account portfolio. Legacy account portfolio. That was the first phrase that stopped my hand on the mouse. My accounts, my 6-year portfolio, described as legacy. Kept reading. The email outlined a timeline for what James called account continuity transfer, a structured handover of primary client relationships from existing senior strategists to the new predictive modeling team. The process was described as a natural evolution of the firm's service model. It was framed as an upgrade, a modernization, an investment in next-generation capability. Andrew Chen's name appeared 4 times. Mine appeared once in a line that read, Eva Hartley to complete knowledge transfer documentation by end of Q4, supporting seamless account continuity. I read that sentence 3 times. Knowledge transfer documentation. I had been training Andrew for 2 months. I had given him my frameworks, my client histories, my communication protocols, my 6 years of institutional knowledge about every relationship in my portfolio. I had done it believing I was mentoring a junior colleague who would work alongside me, supporting a new service line that would expand what we offered together. I had been training my replacement. And James Walker had known it from the first conversation. I want to be precise about what happened in my body in the minutes after I read that email, because I think the physical experience of betrayal is something we don't talk about accurately. It's not dramatic. It's not heat or rage or tears, at least not at first. It's cold. A specific, clarifying cold that starts somewhere behind your sternum and spreads outward slowly, like ice forming on still water. My hands were steady on the keyboard. My coffee was cold on the left side of my desk. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at 4:47 on a Tuesday in October. Moving, indifferent, luminous. Closed the email. I opened a new document, and I started writing down everything I remembered. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to tell you something about Andrew Chen that I didn't know yet at 4:47 p.m. on that Tuesday. I found out 3 days later, in a conversation that happened by accident in the kitchen on the 7th floor, where the good coffee machine was. The one that ground the beans fresh and that most people avoided because it took 4 minutes, but which I used every morning because 4 minutes of a task requiring minimal attention was the closest thing I got to quiet during the workday. Andrew was already there when I walked in. He didn't notice me immediately. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, holding his phone, and I heard him say in a low voice, I know, but I need this job. I just need it to work out. He heard me come in and turned. His expression shifted in a way I recognized. The micro-adjustment of someone who was caught being less composed than they wanted to appear. He put his phone in his pocket and said good morning with the same easy professionalism he always projected. I said good morning. I pressed the button on the machine. We stood in the particular awkward quiet of 2 people who are each waiting for the other to leave first. Then Andrew said without looking at me, Can I ask you something? Said yes. He said, Did James tell you what this role actually is? What it's meant to become? I looked at him carefully. His jaw was tighter than usual. There was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there in our onboarding sessions, a kind of fatigue that went deeper than lack of sleep. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When I interviewed, James told me I'd be building a new service line in collaboration with the existing senior team. That's what I came here for. That's what I relocated for." He paused. "In the last 2 weeks he's been telling me something different. He keeps saying I'll be stepping into existing account relationships." He used the phrase earning key man status on a call last Friday. And when I asked him to clarify the timeline, he changed the subject. The coffee machine finished. Neither of us moved toward it. I said, "Andrew, I need to tell you something." I told him about the email. "I want you to think about this for a moment, because I have thought about it hundreds of times in the years since." Andrew Chen had been told by James Walker that he was coming to Meridian to build something new, a next-generation service line that would make his career. He had relocated his life for that opportunity. He had shown up every day, taken notes in his small black notebook, asked careful questions, absorbed everything I gave him. Genuinely, I believe, because he thought he was learning the foundation of something he was going to build on. He was being used to replace me, but he was also being used. James Walker had sold us both a story. To me, the story was that I was a mentor helping to grow the firm's capabilities. To Andrew, the story was that he was a builder entering a collaborative environment. In reality, James had designed a transition that would quietly eliminate my position while never having a direct conversation with either of us about what was actually happening. Andrew wasn't a villain. He was a tool. And so was I. We stood in the 7th floor kitchen while the coffee went from hot to warm, and I watched Andrew Chen's face process exactly what I had already processed 3 days earlier. The cold spread. The steadiness came. And then something else. Something I hadn't expected. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to think very carefully. And then I'm going to act very precisely." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to help. Whatever you need. I didn't come here for this." I looked at him for a long moment. I was 38 years old and I had been in corporate environments long enough to know that trust is not a reflex. It's a decision. And the quality of that decision depends entirely on what you do with the information you have. What I had was, Andrew had been used. Andrew knew he'd been used. Andrew had told me before he had any reason to believe I would respond with anything other than hostility. That was enough. I said, "Then we need to compare notes." What Andrew told me over the next 4 days. In the 7th floor kitchen, in a corner booth at the deli 2 blocks from the office, in a series of carefully worded messages on Signal that he suggested and I agreed to, fundamentally changed my understanding of what James Walker had actually built. James had recruited Andrew through a headhunter with a specific brief. Find a candidate with strong analytical foundations, excellent interpersonal skills, and enough professional ambition to relocate for a senior track opportunity. The role had been described in the recruitment materials as Strategic Accounts Innovation Lead, a title that existed nowhere in Meridian's current org chart and that James had apparently created for the purpose of the hire. Andrew had been shown, during his interview process, a presentation about Meridian's next-generation service delivery model. The presentation included client relationship data, account performance metrics, and growth projections. Andrew had found it compelling. It described a firm that was evolving thoughtfully, investing in new capabilities, making smart hires. When Andrew sent me a copy of that presentation, I recognized every data point in it. I had produced most of them. The account performance metrics were pulled directly from my quarterly reports. The relationship architecture slides were based on frameworks I had built and documented in training sessions with Andrew over the previous 2 months. James Walker had taken my work, repackaged it as a vision document, and used it to recruit the person he intended to replace me with. I sat with that for a long time. Have you ever had a moment where a pattern you'd been sensing for months suddenly becomes a shape you can see clearly? where the information you had all along rearranges itself into something that was there the whole time, waiting for you to look at it directly. That was what happened when I saw Andrew's interview presentation. I wasn't angry. I want to be precise about that because I think we often assume betrayal produces rage, and sometimes it does. But what I felt was something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that is cold and very, very focused. I opened my documentation folder. I need to tell you something about the weeks that followed before I tell you how it resolved, because the weeks between discovery and resolution are the part that no one talks about. They're the part that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening. From the outside, I continued doing my job exactly as I had before. I showed up. I ran the Thursday morning reviews. I answered emails within the hour. I delivered a client presentation for Hartwell Financial Services that James described in a group Slack message as another example of why Eva's work sets the standard. I smiled in meetings. I want to be honest with you about how hard that was. Not because of the professional discipline required, I had that. But because of what I was carrying home every night, past Daniel's careful expression and Noah's homework questions and Claire's drawings left on the kitchen table, into the specific silence of our bedroom after midnight when the house was asleep and I was sitting on my side of the bed with my laptop open, building what I needed to build. One night Daniel came in around 1 in the morning and sat beside me without saying anything. He looked at the screen, spreadsheets, email threads, document version histories. And then he looked at me. He said, "How long has this been going on?" Told him. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Not advice. Not a solution. Just what do you need? I said, "I need you to keep the kids on schedule for the next 2 weeks. I need normal mornings." He nodded. He went back to bed. And I kept working. I think about that night often. About the specific kind of love that shows up not with answers but with the willingness to hold the space while you find your own. What I was building during those 2 weeks of normal mornings and late nights was a record. Not a complaint. Not a grievance document. A record. Specifically, I was reconstructing the timeline of James Walker's transition plan using documentation that already existed and that I had legitimate access to. Email threads, project files, version histories on shared documents, calendar invitations, Slack message archives. I was also comparing the content of Andrew's interview presentation against the original source documents from my own portfolio to establish the provenance of the material James had used. Andrew was doing the same from his end. He had kept every email from the recruitment process, every version of the offer letter, every message from James about the role's scope and trajectory. He had a particular email sent by James to Andrew in the final week of the recruitment process, before the offer was formally extended, that described the new service line in specific terms and made explicit reference to transitioning existing senior relationships to the new model team. That email was sent 6 weeks before James introduced Andrew to me as a mentee. James had known exactly what he was building when he walked Andrew into my office and asked me to help orient him. He had constructed the entire situation, the framing, the pacing, the language, to ensure that by the time anyone understood what was happening, the knowledge transfer would already be substantially complete. What James had not anticipated was that Andrew would tell me. That was the variable his plan hadn't accounted for. He had assumed that Andrew's professional self-interest would keep him aligned with the person controlling his career trajectory. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that Andrew would feel enough discomfort about what he was being used for to choose differently. He also had not anticipated, and this was the thing that mattered most strategically, that I had been documenting for 6 years and 4 months, and that the documentation folder on my desktop was the most well-organized archive of value creation in Meridian Consulting Group's Strategic Accounts Division. The Hartwell Financial Services quarterly business review was scheduled for the second Thursday of November. It was the most significant client meeting in my portfolio. A 3-hour session with the CFO, the COO, and 2 board members, reviewing the year's performance and setting priorities for the following 12 months. James had, 3 weeks earlier, added Andrew to the meeting invitation. He had introduced this quietly, in a brief message that described it as an opportunity for Andrew to observe a senior-level client engagement. He had not asked me. He had not discussed it. I had noted the invitation edition in my documentation folder, dated it, and said nothing. The morning of the Hartwell review, I arrived at the office at 7:15. The conference room on the 4th floor was already set up. The long glass table, the chairs arranged in the standard client configuration, the presentation loaded on the room's display system. I sat at the head of the table and I reviewed my materials for the last time, the way I always did before a major presentation, going through each section not to memorize it but to confirm that I knew it well enough that no question could surprise me. Andrew arrived at 8. He sat in the chair to my right, the position for a supporting presenter, not an observer. I had told him the previous day exactly where to sit. He placed a printed copy of the analysis he had prepared on the table in front of him. At 9 o'clock, the Hartwell team arrived. Robert Keane, the CFO, was a compact, silver-haired man in his early 60s who had a handshake that assessed you in 3 seconds and a memory for numbers that I had always found both impressive and slightly intimidating. He greeted me by name and with genuine warmth. We had worked together for 6 years, and that relationship was real regardless of anything else. James Walker arrived 30 seconds after the Hartwell team, which I recognized as a choice rather than an accident. He came in the way he always came into high-stakes rooms, deliberate, unhurried, the slight smile of a man who is confident that the room will arrange itself around him. He saw me at the head of the table. He saw Andrew beside me. He saw the folder I had placed, very deliberately, at the center of the table in front of my chair. The folder was plain manila. It contained a single document, a 64-page account relationship history for Hartwell Financial Services, covering 6 years of strategic work, every deliverable, every recommendation, every outcome, with authorship and dating on every section. James's expression didn't change. That was the thing about James Walker. His face was very controlled, but I had been in enough rooms with him to read the things that weren't in his expression. The way his jaw moved slightly, the way his hand rested on the back of a chair rather than reaching to shake Robert Keane's hand immediately. He had not expected the folder. He sat down at the table, 3 seats from me. The meeting began. I want to be clear about what I did in that room, because it would be easy to mischaracterize it as confrontational, and it was not. It was the opposite of confrontational. It was the most composed, professional, technically excellent presentation I had ever delivered. Everything was documented, sourced, attributed. Every recommendation I made for the following year was grounded in 6 years of relationship history that I knew better than anyone in that room, and that Andrew, to his considerable credit, had prepared supporting analysis for in a way that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than surface familiarity. What I did in the middle of the presentation was introduce Andrew Chen to Robert Keane in a way that was not on the agenda and that James Walker could not object to without making himself conspicuous. I said, I also want to take a moment to introduce Andrew Chen, who has been working closely with me this quarter on the predictive modeling analysis you'll see in the 3rd section. Andrew, do you want to walk Robert and the team through what you found? Andrew did. He was good. He was genuinely good, not because he was performing but because the work was solid and he understood it. After Andrew finished, Robert Keane looked at him for a moment and then looked at me and said, "You put together a strong team, Eva. This is exactly the kind of integrated analysis we've been hoping for." James Walker said nothing. After the meeting, as the Hartwell team was leaving and the room was reorganizing itself, Robert Keane paused beside me and said quietly, "I hope Meridian knows what they have in you." Thanked him. I watched him walk out. I turned around and James Walker was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking at the city. He said without turning, "That was an interesting choice." I said, "It was a client presentation. I made the choices that served the client." turn. The easy smile was in place. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. He said, "We should find time to talk this week." I said, "I'll have my assistant reach out to yours." I picked up my folder from the table and walked out of the conference room. I went to the bathroom on the 4th floor. The one at the far end of the hall, past the supply room, that nobody used because it was out of the way. I stood at the sink and looked at my own face in the mirror. The blonde hair pulled back, the controlled expression I'd been maintaining for 3 hours. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself feel the full weight of it. All of it. The 6 years. The 4:47 email. The kitchen conversations with Andrew. The late nights while Daniel kept the kids on schedule. Folder. Room. I thought about Noah at his soccer practice last Saturday, looking for me in the stands and finding Daniel instead. I thought about Claire's drawing on the kitchen table, a house with 4 figures in front of it, crayon blue sky, all of them the same height. Breathe. I straightened my jacket. I went back to my desk. The conversation with James Walker happened on a Friday morning, in his corner office with the door closed. He had a view of the city from 2 sides. He sat behind his desk and I sat in the chair across from him, and we were 2 people who both understood completely that this was not a casual conversation. James opened by saying he wanted to talk about the Q1 planning process and how my role might evolve given the new service line development. He used the word evolution 3 times. He used the phrase natural transition twice. He used the word legacy once, in a context that was clearly meant to sound positive but landed the way it always lands, as a noun that means past tense. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I opened the folder I had brought, not the Hartwell folder, a different one, and I placed it on the desk between us. I said, "I want to share something with you before we go further." The folder contained 4 things. The first was a timeline, 14 pages, dated entries, documenting every stage of what I now understood to be the account transition plan. James's introduction of Andrew, the expansion of client email access, the meeting invitations, the language in internal communications about knowledge transfer. Every entry was sourced to a specific document or communication. The second was the provenance analysis I had prepared, comparing the content of Andrew's interview presentation against my original source documents, slide by slide, with the dates of my original files attached. The third was a copy of Andrew's recruitment email from James, the one that described the transition of existing senior relationships 6 weeks before Andrew ever set foot in the building, alongside my employment contracts clause on role security and the firm's internal policy on structural changes to senior account positions, which required 60 days written notice and a formal review process that had not occurred. The fourth was a letter from Robert Keane, which he had sent to me that morning after I had, the previous evening, given him a brief and factual account of the situation. The letter expressed Hartwell Financial Services' commitment to their account relationship, and specifically named me as the individual whose continuity they considered essential to the engagement. It was, as letters go, exceptionally clear. James read through the folder without speaking. He was very good at not showing things. But the easy smile was gone, and it did not come back. When he finished, he looked up and said, "What is it you're proposing, Eva?" I said, "I'm not proposing anything. I'm documenting a situation. What happens next is a decision the firm needs to make with full information rather than partial information." He said, "And Andrew?" I said, "Andrew was brought here under a misrepresentation of his role. That's a separate conversation that HR should be part of." James looked at the folder for a moment. Then he looked at me. And I saw something in his face that I hadn't expected. Not quite remorse, but something adjacent to it. The recognition, perhaps, of a man who has been very good at a certain kind of management and who has just encountered the specific consequence of having been too good at it for too long. He said, "This didn't have to go this way." I said, "No, it didn't." The silence between us lasted long enough to have a shape. Then James said, "Give me the week." I said, You have until Thursday. I want to be careful about how I tell you the resolution, because this is the part where it's easy to make something sound cleaner than it was. James Walker did not lose his job. I want to say that plainly because the satisfying version of this story would end with consequences proportional to the behavior, and that's not consistently how corporate environments operate. James had relationships with the firm's managing partners that were older than my tenure. He was good at what he did in the ways that the firm measured being good. He was not going to be removed for a transition plan that was awkward to explain but technically defensible. What happened was a negotiation. It happened over 3 days, involving me, James, the head of HR whose name was Sylvia Torres and who turned out to be someone I should have spoken to months earlier, and eventually one of the managing partners. I was represented in part by an employment attorney I had consulted quietly the previous week, which was a decision that cost me $800 and was worth every cent. The outcome. My position was formally confirmed and restructured with expanded scope. Senior Director of Strategic Accounts, a title that reflected what I had actually been doing for 2 years. My compensation was adjusted upward. The knowledge transfer documentation language was removed from all internal planning documents. Robert Keene's letter went into my permanent personnel file. Andrew Chen's role was renegotiated as well. He was given an actual innovation mandate, a real one built around his actual skills rather than around absorbing mine. Sylvia Torres made clear to James that the recruitment misrepresentation created significant exposure for the firm, and James, who was good at understanding which risks were worth carrying, agreed to a restructured scope for Andrew that served both the firm and Andrew genuinely. Andrew sent me a message the evening after the negotiations concluded. It said, "I know this wasn't the outcome you deserved, but it's more than I expected. Thank you for including me in the solution instead of treating me as part of the problem." I read that message twice. Then I saved it in a new folder I created on my desktop. I labeled it, "People Who Showed Up." James Walker left Meridian Consulting Group 14 months later. His departure was described in the internal announcement as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities. I don't know the full circumstances. I didn't ask. There are things that resolve themselves on their own timelines, and there's wisdom in understanding the difference between the resolution you pursue and the one you wait for. I am still at Meridian Consulting Group. I have been there for 9 years now. My team has grown to 7 people. The Hartwell Financial Services account celebrated its 9th year with us last spring, and Robert Keene, who retired in the interim, sent me a handwritten note when he heard about my promotion. I have a new documentation folder. It's more organized than the first one. Noah is 12 now and plays soccer on a competitive team and looks for me in the stands and finds me there. Claire is 9 and still makes drawings on the kitchen table, but now they're quite good, actually, detailed and specific, the kind of art that makes you look twice. Daniel still teaches high school history and still has that expression sometimes, but it appears less frequently, and when it does I try to name what I'm seeing instead of moving past it. I don't know if I got what I deserved. I'm not sure deserved is a frame that corporate environments are built to honor. What I know is that I got a result that was grounded in evidence I had the discipline to keep, in an alliance I had the judgment to build, and in a decision made at a kitchen table at 1 a.m. by a husband who asked what I needed instead of telling me what to do. Maybe that's justice. Or maybe I finally understood how the game is really played, and decided that understanding the game was not the same as accepting its terms. Before I let you go, I want to say something directly to the person watching this who is in a version of what I was in. Not just if you're being pushed out. Not just if you found an email you weren't supposed to find or felt the specific cold of understanding something you can't ununderstand. Also if you're the Andrew in the story. If you've been placed inside a situation and handed a role and told a story about it that you're beginning to suspect isn't the full truth. Here is what I would tell both of you. Document. Not because you're paranoid. Because the responsible thing is to have the record before you need it. The same way the responsible thing is to have the emergency fund before the emergency. Understand who the actual problem is before you decide who the adversary is. Andrew Chen was not my adversary. He was a person in a compromised position who made a choice to tell me the truth when he had no reason to believe that would benefit him. That choice changed everything. Be precise about where the actual manipulation is coming from before you spend energy on the wrong target. And this is the hardest one. Act from clarity, not from hurt. The moment I read that email, the part of me that wanted to react immediately, to forward it, to confront James in the hallway, to do something visible and immediate, that part was real. It was justified. And it would have destroyed every advantage I had. The advantage was in the folder. The advantage was in the patience. The advantage was in waiting for the right room at the right moment with the right documentation in my hands. Whatever you're carrying right now, whatever you've read or heard or understood that you weren't meant to understand, the most powerful thing you can do with it is become very organized and very quiet and very precise. Not forever. Just long enough. The right moment will come. And when it does, you want to be ready. Thank you for staying until the end. There's something I didn't tell you yet. Something that happened between the Hartwell meeting and the conversation with James that I've thought about many times since and that I think belongs in this story. The night before I met with James, the Thursday evening after I had already confirmed Andrew would be in the building early the next day, and after I had organized the folder for the last time, I sat in my car in Meridian's parking garage for approximately 20 minutes without starting the engine. I don't know exactly what I was doing. Processing maybe. Or just being still in a way that the previous 2 weeks hadn't allowed. The garage was mostly empty by 7:30. The fluorescent lights buzzed at the same frequency they always do in parking structures. That particular flat hum that makes everything look slightly unreal. I was thinking about James Walker. Not about what he'd done. I'd already thought about that enough to understand it completely. I was thinking about how he'd done it. The precision of it. Patience. He had identified what he wanted. A transition of account relationships to a newer, cheaper talent layer. And he had constructed a pathway to that outcome that gave him plausible deniability at every step. He had used me to train Andrew without ever having the direct conversation that would have required him to take a position. He had used Andrew to absorb my institutional knowledge without ever explicitly telling Andrew that was the purpose. He had created a situation in which the outcome he wanted could be achieved through a series of individually defensible actions rather than one explicitly indefensible one. It was, I had to admit to myself sitting in that parking garage, a sophisticated piece of organizational engineering. And the thing that bothered me, the thing that kept circling back, was the question of whether I had done anything similar. Not to Andrew, not to anyone specific, but in my career more broadly. How many times had I made choices that served my outcomes while framing them in language that sounded neutral? How many times had I benefited from an information asymmetry without examining it too carefully? I didn't have clean answers. I don't have them now. What I had sitting in that parking garage was the decision to be honest about the question. I think that matters. I think the version of this story where I emerge as a pure protagonist who was simply wronged by a bad actor is a simpler and less accurate story than the one where I take seriously the question of what I'm capable of and what standards I want to hold myself to. Not out of false modesty. Out of the recognition that the clarity I felt about what James had done was only useful if I carried it forward in how I operated. Not just as a protection against being manipulated again, but as a constraint on how I was willing to treat other people. I started the car. I drove home. Noah had saved me the last piece of the pizza Daniel had ordered, wrapped in foil on the counter with my name written on the foil in marker in Noah's handwriting, slightly uneven on the N. I ate it standing at the counter in the dark kitchen. It was the best piece of pizza I can remember eating. One more thing. About Andrew. Andrew Chen stayed at Meridian Consulting Group for 2 years after the restructuring. He built a genuinely useful predictive modeling capability. Not a replacement for relationship-based account management, but a complement to it, which was what he had been told he was coming to build and what he turned out to be genuinely skilled at doing. I worked with him as a peer during those 2 years, and he was good to work with. Precise, honest, willing to say when he didn't know something rather than covering the gap with confidence. He left Meridian in the spring of the following year for a role at a firm in Boston. Before he left, he stopped by my desk. Not with anything dramatic, just stopped by, the way people do on their last week, and he said, "I want you to know that when I think about the most important professional decision I ever made, it's that conversation in the kitchen." I could have stayed quiet. Everything about the incentive structure said I should stay quiet. I'm glad I didn't. I said I was glad too. I meant it in more ways than I could explain quickly, so I didn't try. What I thought about after he left was this. The thing that broke James Walker's plan was not my documentation. My documentation was what made the resolution possible. But it wasn't what made it happen. What made it happen was a person who, when presented with an opportunity to benefit from someone else's disadvantage, chose to say the true thing instead. That's not something you can document in advance. You can't build it into a folder. You can only be the kind of person who does it, and hope that somewhere in the structures you operate inside, there's at least one other person who will do the same. I've thought about that a lot. About what it means for how I manage my own team. About whether I create the conditions in which the people around me feel able to tell me the true thing when the true thing is inconvenient. I don't always succeed at this. But I try to ask the question. The last thing I want to tell you is small. It happened at Claire's school recital about 3 months after everything was resolved. She was doing a piece on the recorder. Not a sophisticated instrument, but she had been practicing for 6 weeks and she was determined to play it perfectly, which is very Claire. This way she has of deciding that something is worth doing correctly and then just doing it correctly through sheer insistence. I was there. Not watching the clock for a message I needed to answer. Not running the meeting prep in the background of my mind. Not doing that thing I do sometimes where I'm physically present but only partially there. I was there. She played her piece. She made one small mistake in the third measure and recovered immediately and finished clean. When she came off the stage, she found me in the audience before she found Daniel, which she doesn't always do. And she came and stood beside me and took my hand and said, "Did you hear me mess up?" I said I heard it. She said, "I fixed it." I said, "You did." She looked up at me for a moment with that particular expression she has. Evaluating, precise, more like me than I sometimes feel comfortable acknowledging. And then she said, "You were really here." Not a question. An observation. I said, "I was." That's what I want to leave you with. Not the folder. Not the email. Not the conference room or the parking garage or the Friday morning conversation with James Walker or any of the professional mechanics of what happened. The piece of pizza wrapped in foil. Claire's hand. The recognition that being present is not a passive state. It's a choice you make repeatedly against 100 competing pulls, and the quality of everything that matters is determined by how often you make it right. Whatever you're facing at work, whatever someone has set in motion around you that you're only now beginning to understand, it is solvable. Not perfectly, not without cost, not on the timeline you'd prefer, but solvable. Document carefully. Choose your allies with precision. Act from clarity rather than hurt. And then go home and be there. Thank you for watching.